Persia was supposed to disappear. That is the simple version, the outsider's version, the version that sounds obvious the moment you hear it. In the 7th century, Arab Muslim armies exploded out of Arabia, smashed one of the most powerful empires on earth, and took Persia. The old Sasanian Empire collapsed. Its king was hunted down, its armies were broken, its fire temples dimmed. Islam spread. Arabic became the language of revelation, empire, and prestige. So that should have been the end of the story. A conquered Persia should have become Arab, the way so many people assume conquest works. One civilization defeats another. One language rises, another retreats. One world ends, and another takes its place. Clean, final, irreversible. Except that is not what happened. Iran was conquered, but it did not become Arab. It became Muslim, yes. It was ruled by Arab elites, yes. It absorbed Arabic vocabulary, Islamic law, and a new religious universe, yes. But somehow, beneath all of that change, something older stayed alive. Persian identity did not vanish. Persian language came back. Persian memory returned. Persian political culture re-emerged. And over time, one of the strangest reversals in history began to unfold. The conquerors changed Iran, but Iran also changed the civilization that conquered it. That is the mystery. And it is bigger than it sounds, because this is not just a question about names or flags or what language people happen to speak at court. It is a question about what a civilization actually is. Is it a dynasty? A religion? A ruling class? A language? A myth of itself? How much can be torn away before the thing itself is gone? Persia, at first glance, should have failed that test. The Arab conquests were not a border skirmish. They were not a temporary occupation. They were a civilizational shock. The Sasanian Empire, which had ruled for centuries and fought Rome and Byzantium as an equal, did not merely lose a province. It lost the world it had built. The imperial center cracked. The old order broke apart. The map changed. So did the heavens above it. The religion of the state no longer ruled the state. The language of sacred power was no longer the same. The men who governed, taxed, judged, and commanded were no longer the same men. Everything that usually tells you a civilization has fallen, fell. And yet, Iran remained. Not untouched, not unchanged, not frozen in some romantic pre-Islamic past. That is what makes this story far more interesting than nostalgia. Iran did not survive by refusing history. It survived by going through it, by absorbing the blow, by letting the surface transform while something deeper adapted, retreated, waited, and then returned in another form. That is why this story matters. Because once you see it clearly, the Arab conquest stops looking like a simple tale of replacement. It becomes something more unsettling and more impressive. A story about conquest without disappearance, about a people who lost political independence but not civilizational memory, about a land that accepted a new religion without surrendering all of its older instincts, about an empire that died but left behind habits of rule, language, prestige, and imagination so durable that even new rulers would eventually begin wearing Persian civilization like a borrowed crown. And the Arab conquest was only the first test. That is what gives this story its real scale. The same land would later be entered by Turks, by Mongols, by dynasties that did not begin as Persian at all. And yet again and again, Iran would do something almost impossible. It would bend, absorb, translate, survive. Not by staying pure, by staying continuous. That is much harder and much rarer. Because most people think civilizations die when they are conquered. But some civilizations die much earlier, the moment they can no longer remember themselves. Iran did not forget itself. Not completely. Not even when its empire was gone. Not even when its rulers changed. Not even when its language was pushed aside from the center of power. Which means the real question is not whether Persia was conquered. It was. The real question is what exactly the conquerors took, and what they never managed to destroy. To understand that, we have to go back to the moment before the fall, before the Arab armies, before Islam entered the Iranian plateau, when Persia still looked like a giant that could not be broken. Because the truth is, by the time the conquerors arrived, the empire they were about to destroy was already bleeding from the inside. To understand why Persia did not vanish after the Arab conquest, you first have to see what Persia was at the moment before the fall. From a distance, the Sasanian Empire still looked immense. It was ancient, wealthy, sophisticated, and feared. Its court projected majesty. Its cities carried the memory of centuries. Its kings had long stood as rivals to Rome and then Byzantium. Not as some peripheral power, but as one of the great centers of the world. It looked permanent. But permanence is one of history's most dangerous illusions. By the early 7th century, the Sasanian state was still magnificent on the surface, yet underneath, it was straining under the weight of its own ambition. The empire had spent generations locked in a brutal contest with Byzantium, and under Khusro II, that struggle reached a fever pitch. At first, Persia seemed to be winning everything. Sasanian armies surged west. They took Syria. They took Egypt. They reached deep into Byzantine territory and looked, for a moment, almost unstoppable. That should have been the high point. Instead, it became the beginning of the collapse. Because wars like that do not just consume soldiers. They consume legitimacy, treasure, confidence, and time. The victories were vast, but so was the cost. And when the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius struck back, the reversal was devastating. Persia did not simply lose ground. It lost momentum, prestige, and the aura of inevitability that keeps empires standing even when they are exhausted. The machine was still there, but it was grinding itself apart. Then the blows began to pile up. War had already drained the treasury and overburdened the population. Taxation pressed harder. Noble families grew more fractious. The court became less secure. And over all of it hung another kind of devastation. Quieter, but just as deadly. Disease, famine, demographic shock. The empire was not just fighting enemies, it was fighting depletion itself. This is the part many people miss. They imagine the Arab conquest as the collision between a fully intact Persian superpower and a sudden outside force. But that flattens the story. The real Persia the Arabs encountered was not at its peak. It was a wounded imperial order, still proud, still dangerous, but already weakened by overreach, internal fracture, and crisis at the center. And then the center broke. In 628, Khosrow II was overthrown. What followed was not a smooth transfer of power, but chaos. Rulers rose and fell with startling speed. The throne became unstable. The elite turned inward. Factions competed. Authority thinned out. In only a few years, the empire cycled through multiple sovereigns, including child rulers and contested claims, while the structure that was supposed to command the empire lost its grip over the empire it claimed to rule. The state still existed, but it no longer spoke with one voice. That mattered because empires are not only held together by armies, they are held together by belief. People have to believe the center can still protect, punish, organize, and endure. Once that faith begins to rot, even powerful states can collapse with astonishing speed. Orders are ignored. Provinces become more self-protective. Local interests begin outweighing imperial ones. The map remains the same, but the cohesion underneath it starts to disappear. And this was the world into which the Arab-Muslim forces emerged. They did not arrive on the edge of a stable order. They arrived at a moment when two exhausted superpowers, Byzantium and Persia, had nearly destroyed one another. But Persia was in worse condition. Byzantium bent and recovered. The Sasanian state bent and began to come apart. So when the new Muslim armies struck, they were not entering a calm imperial landscape. They were entering a space of shock, fatigue, and dislocation. That does not make the conquest less remarkable. It makes it more understandable. Because what happened next was not magic. It was a collision between a force rising with fierce religious and political momentum and an empire that had lost the internal balance required to survive another existential blow. The Arab armies were disciplined, mobile, energized by a new unifying faith, and facing an enemy whose institutions were still impressive, but no longer fully coherent. That is how seemingly eternal worlds end. Not when they look weak, but when they still look strong enough to fool everyone. And that is why the fall of Sasanian Persia was so shocking. The empire did not die slowly in plain sight. It died while still carrying the image of grandeur, which meant that when the collapse came, it felt total, final, as if not only a state, but an entire civilization had been swept off the stage. But states and civilizations are not the same thing. The empire was about to fall. And that is where the real story begins. When the blow finally landed, it landed hard. This part of the story should not be softened, because too many romantic versions of history do that. The Arab conquest of Persia was real. It was violent. It was destabilizing. It broke an empire that had dominated the Iranian world for centuries. Major battles like Al-Qadisiyah and Nahavand were not symbolic moments. They shattered Sasanian military resistance, opened the interior of Iran, and accelerated the collapse of a state that was already staggering. By 651, the last Sasanian Shah, Yazdegerd III, was dead, and with him died the old imperial order that had ruled Iran from Ctesiphon to the eastern frontiers. And when empires die, the change is not abstract. Tax systems change. Landholding changes. Sacred authority changes. The men who arrive to govern, judge, collect, and command are no longer the same men. Arab garrison towns rise. New military elites appear. The prestige of Arabic rises with the prestige of Islam. Zoroastrianism, once tied to the power of the state, begins losing the political shelter that had protected it. The old order does not simply fade. It is pushed aside. The world people were born into begins disappearing while they are still alive enough to remember it. That is what conquest feels like. But here is where the story refuses to stay simple. Political defeat is not the same thing as civilizational erasure. A dynasty can fall in a decade. An administrative system can be seized in a generation. A capital can be looted in a week. But language, memory, social habit, and inherited prestige do not obey the same clock. They do not vanish just because a battlefield was lost. And in Iran, they did not. Even the sources on the conquest make clear that resistance did not instantly disappear after the major victories. There were continued local struggles. Tribute arrangements had to be enforced and reinforced. And the conquest of the Iranian world was a drawn process. Not one clean cinematic moment where a civilization simply blinked out. That matters because the outsider's mistake begins right there. People often imagine that once Arab rule entered Iran, Iran must have immediately become Arab in the way Egypt or the Levant gradually became Arabic-speaking over time. But Iran was different. Not because it escaped change, it did not. And not because it heroically froze itself against history. It did not do that either. Iran changed profoundly. Islam spread. Arabic entered scholarship, religion, and administration. New Persian itself would eventually be written in Arabic script and absorb a large Arabic vocabulary. But beneath those changes, the underlying Persian linguistic structure survived and evolved rather than disappearing. The language bent. It did not break. And language was only part of it. What survived in Iran was also a civilizational memory. The Arab armies had conquered a state, but Iran was more than the Sasanian court. It was cities, landed elites, regional identities, scribal habits, stories of kingship, and a deep sense that this land belonged to an older historical world. You could remove the crown. You could kill the Shah. You could reorder taxes and religion. But you could not instantly delete the idea of Iran from the minds of people who still lived inside its landscapes, still carried its habits, and still remembered that another order had existed before this one. This is why the fall of the Sasanians was both total and incomplete. Total, because the empire itself truly died. Incomplete, because the people beneath the empire did not dissolve along with it. They adapted. Some converted quickly. Some resisted. Some negotiated. Some entered the new order. Some withdrew to local strongholds. Some preserved older traditions for generations. The transition was uneven, messy, and often painful. But that very messiness is the point. Civilizations do not disappear only because new rulers say they should. Sometimes they survive in provincial towns, in household speech, in administrative memory, in poetry not yet written, in habits of rank and legitimacy, waiting for a new political form. That is exactly what was happening in Iran. So yes, the conquest was real. That must be faced first. Persia was not never conquered. It was conquered so deeply that its imperial religion lost the state, its ruling dynasty vanished, and a new universal faith entered the land for good. But the assumption that conquest automatically meant Arabization misses the harder truth. Iran was not spared by history. It was remade by it. And somehow, in the middle of that remaking, it retained enough of itself to return in another form. Which means the next question becomes unavoidable. If the old empire was gone, then what carried Iran through the collapse? The answer was not an army. It was something the conquerors themselves would soon discover they needed. The first surprise after conquest was simple and brutal. Winning Iran was one thing, ruling it was another. Armies can take a capital, they can break a dynasty, they can terrorize a countryside into submission. But once the war banners come down, someone still has to count the land, assess the taxes, manage the cities, record the obligations, settle disputes, move grain, pay soldiers, and keep a huge territory from sliding into chaos. And that is where the conquerors ran into a problem. Iran was not an empty prize. It was one of the most administratively sophisticated regions in the old world, and ruling it required habits of government that had been built long before the Arab conquest. Even the very word divan, the term for registers and government offices in the Islamic world, was itself a Persian loanword carried into Arabic from older Iranian usage. That detail matters more than it seems, because it means the conquest was never just a story of one people imposing itself on another from above. Almost immediately, the new rulers found themselves depending on inherited systems they had not created. They could conquer the Sasanian state, but they could not simply improvise a replacement for everything the state had done. So beneath the new political order, older Iranian habits of administration, scribal culture, and fiscal management did not vanish. They were absorbed, repurposed, and quietly kept alive inside the machinery of the caliphate. The empire changed hands. The techniques of rule proved harder to replace. And then the story turned even further. The early Umayyad world still carried the stamp of Arab military aristocracy, with conquered peoples placed below the old Arab ruling stratum. But the Abbasid revolution that overthrew the Umayyads in 750 was incubated in Khorasan, in the Iranian east, and it drew major support from Persians and other non-Arab Muslims who had grown tired of that order. Encyclopedia Iranica describes the Abbasid movement as closely linked with Persia, with its propaganda and first great successes rooted in eastern Iran, and with Abu of Khorasan as one of its principal agents. Britannica likewise notes that the Abbasids gained crucial backing from Persians in Khorasan. This was not just a palace coup. It was a shift in who mattered inside the empire. So now the old question changed. It was no longer only whether Iran could survive Arab rule. It was whether Arab rule itself could remain purely Arab once it depended on Iran so heavily. Under the Abbasids, the answer became harder and harder to ignore. The dynasty moved the imperial center eastward to Baghdad. Persian administrators rose into important posts. Iranian political and artistic influence deepened, especially under caliphs like al-Ma'mun. Even older historians noticed the change. As Iranica summarizes, the Abbasid order swept aside the older pattern of Arab military domination and increasingly elevated Mawali and non-Arab officials, many of them Persian. The empire was becoming broader, more cosmopolitan, less tribal, and far more open to Iranian forms of statecraft. And then came the men who embodied that reversal. The Barmakids were a family from Balkh in the Iranian east, who rose to become some of the most powerful secretaries and viziers of the early Abbasid age. Their influence under Harun al-Rashid was so great that the office of vizier itself is often described by Britannica as taking shape during their tenure. Iranica calls them a family of secretaries and viziers of the early Abbasids, rooted in the region of Balkh and deeply woven into the rise of the new dynasty. In other words, one of the most famous governing families of the Caliphate was not Arab at all. It came from lands the Caliphate had conquered. This is where the deeper irony begins to bite. The Arabs had defeated Persia militarily, but the Caliphate that emerged afterward increasingly relied on Persianate personnel, Persianate methods, and Persian ideas of political grandeur. Not in a neat, total ideological way, not all at once, but enough to change the texture of rule itself. Iran was no longer outside the empire, staring at its conquerors across a battlefield. Iran was now inside the imperial bloodstream, shaping how power worked from within. And yet, something even more important had not happened. Iranian minds were helping run the empire. Iranian habits were helping stabilize it. Iranian elites were returning through service, skill, and influence. But Iran still did not fully speak in its own public voice. Arabic remained the language of revelation, high scholarship, and much of imperial culture. Persian memory had survived. Persian administration had survived. Persian prestige was returning in fragments. But the language itself had not yet made its great comeback. When it did, everything changed. Empires do not only rule through armies. They rule through language. Not just the language of command, but the language that teaches people what counts as beautiful, what counts as serious, what counts as civilization itself. After the Arab conquest, Arabic rose with enormous force. It was the language of revelation, law, theology, scholarship, and imperial prestige. If Persian identity had truly been hollow, that should have been the end of it. The old imperial language should have receded into memory and never returned as a public force. But it did return, and that return changed everything. This is the point where survival became a comeback. Because Persian did not come back as a museum relic. It did not return as a dead language embalmed for nostalgia. It returned as new Persian, shaped in the Islamic world that had replaced the Sasanian one, written in Arabic script, carrying a great deal of Arabic vocabulary, and yet unmistakably Persian in structure, rhythm, and inheritance. It had adapted to the new order without surrendering its core. That is what made it so powerful. Iran was not recovering by pretending the conquest had never happened. It was turning the materials of the new world into a vehicle for its own continuity. That matters more than it sounds. Because when people imagine cultural survival, they often imagine purity. They imagine some untouched remnant hidden from history. But that is almost never how real civilizations endure. They endure by changing shape. New Persian was exactly that kind of survival. It emerged after the Islamic conquest, not before it. It was a language reborn inside the very civilization that was supposed to have replaced Persia. And that meant Iranian identity was no longer just surviving in memory or administration. It was beginning to speak again in a voice that the new age could hear. And then the right political shelter appeared. In the east, beyond the old imperial center, Iranian dynasties began creating space for Persian language and culture to rise again. The Samanids were the great turning point. Ruling from Transoxiana and Khorasan, they were formally tied to the Abbasid world, but culturally they gave something back to Iran that had been waiting for its moment. Britannica describes them as an Iranian dynasty renowned for giving new force to Iranian national expression, while Iranica notes that it was at the Samanid court that Persian revived as a vehicle for poetry, scholarship, and historical writing. Under them, the comeback stopped being local and became visible. This is where the story stops being defensive. Until now, Iran has been surviving, adapting, infiltrating. But with the Samanids, Iran begins creating again. Court poetry flourishes. Prose develops. A language that might have been pushed to the margins instead becomes a medium of refinement and power. Rudaki appears at the Samanid court and helps give Persian literature one of its first great public voices. What had lived in households, regions, and inherited memory now rises into prestige culture. The language does not merely return, it begins climbing. And the symbolism of that is enormous, because once a civilization can write beautifully again in its own tongue, it is no longer only preserving itself, it is imagining itself forward. Poetry matters here not because it is decorative, but because poetry is where a culture hears its own soul. Chronicles matter not because they record dates, but because they tell a people that their past is still worthy of narration. Language is how memory becomes public again. Language is how prestige returns. Language is how a civilization ceases to feel conquered in its own imagination, even if political power is still fragmented. And there was one more twist. Persian did not come back in opposition to Islam. It came back through an Islamic civilization that had made room for it. That is one of the deepest reasons this story is so easy to misunderstand. Iran did not survive by rejecting the new religion outright. It survived by entering the Islamic world so deeply that it could reshape part of that world from within. Persian became one of the great languages of Islamic civilization, not a stubborn fossil outside it. The old assumption had been that Islamization would mean Arabization. But in Iran, Islam took root while Persian returned alongside it. Religion changed, civilization persisted. That is when the balance of the story changes. Because a conquered people can survive quietly for generations and still disappear in the end. But once their language returns as a language of literature, legitimacy, and elite culture, the entire trajectory shifts. Now the question is no longer whether Iran will endure in private. Now the question is how far this Persian revival will spread. And the answer is far beyond Iran itself. Because once Persian found its voice again, it did not stay home. A civilization does not fully return the moment it survives. It returns when other people start borrowing its language to describe power, beauty, refinement, and legitimacy. That is when survival turns into influence. That is when endurance becomes radiance. And that is what happened to Persia after the conquest. Persian did not merely reappear inside Iran. It began moving outward across the Eastern Islamic world until the language of a conquered civilization became one of the great languages of high culture far beyond its original political borders. This is the part that makes the whole story feel almost impossible. Because at first glance, conquest should have worked in one direction only. Arabia conquers Persia. Islam enters Iran. Arabic rises, Persian retreats. That is the simple model. But history was doing something stranger. In the centuries after the conquest, Persian became a major literary and courtly language across Khorasan, Transoxiana, Afghanistan, and eventually deep into the Indian subcontinent. It was not replacing Arabic in religion or scripture. Arabic still held enormous authority as the language of the Quran, law, and much scholarship. But alongside that sacred prestige, Persian was becoming the language of courts, poetry, chronicles, political memory, and civilizational polish. And once that happened, the meaning of conquest began to reverse. Because now the question was no longer who had won on the battlefield. The question was, whose civilization taught the victors how to rule elegantly, how to speak nobly, how to imagine kingship, and how to present themselves as more than armed men on horseback. Persian was not spreading only because Persians demanded it. It was spreading because ambitious courts found it useful, prestigious, and beautiful. A language that had survived the fall of its empire was now becoming a badge of sophistication for other powers. That is not just cultural persistence. That is cultural ascendancy. The Ghaznavids show how astonishing this process really was. They were a dynasty of Turkish slave origin, not ethnic Persians. Their rise came out of the military politics of the late Samanid world, not out of some restored ancient Iranian monarchy. And yet the world they helped build was deeply Persianate. They ruled in the eastern Iranian lands, then projected power into northwestern India, carrying Persian court culture with them. In Lahore, the later Ghaznavid capital, Iranica states plainly that although the Ghaznavids were ethnic Turks, they were wholly assimilated to Persian culture. Persian was the language of the court, and Ghaznavid Lahore had become a typical Persian city. That is a remarkable sentence. The conquerors of yesterday had become the cultural teachers of tomorrow. And Persia did not stop at the Indus. From the beginning of Muslim rule in northern India, Iranica notes, Persian, as the language of the Ghaznavid court, gradually became the most prestigious language across an expanding region whose rulers were mostly Turkish and whose subjects were mostly Indian. Over time, the amount of Persian literature composed in the Indian subcontinent would become enormous, eventually even exceeding that produced in Iran proper during long stretches of the pre-modern era. Think about what that means. A civilization that had once seemed defeated inside its own homeland had become so culturally powerful that its language flourished on foreign soil under foreign dynasties, shaping whole new worlds of administration, poetry, and memory. This is why the story cannot be reduced to ethnicity. Persian influence spread not because Persian blood ruled everywhere, but because Persian civilization had become a system of prestige. It offered rulers a style of kingship, a literary universe, a political vocabulary, and a courtly language that could elevate their power. You could be Turkic in origin, Muslim in faith, and militarily dominant by force of conquest, and still need Persian to make your authority feel complete. Persian was becoming more than the language of one people. It was becoming one of the operating languages of an entire civilizational zone. And that is the deeper reversal. The Arab conquest had transformed Iran forever. That remains true. But the world created after that conquest did not remain simply Arab in cultural texture, especially in the East. It became layered, hybrid, and increasingly Persianate. The civilization that had been conquered was now reshaping the emotional and aesthetic grammar of the world that rose above it. Not by restoring the Sasanian Empire, not by rolling back Islam, but by making itself indispensable to the civilization that came after both. By now, the viewer can feel the pattern beginning to emerge. Iran did not survive because history spared it. Iran survived because its language, memory, and prestige became too valuable to erase. And the most powerful proof was still ahead. Because the next great rulers of the Iranian world would not be Arab either. They would be Turks. And they too would end up ruling through Persian ideas. By now, the story had already become strange. Iran had been conquered by Arabs, absorbed into an Islamic empire, and yet somehow had not dissolved. Persian language had returned. Persian bureaucrats had returned. Persian court culture had returned. But a skeptic could still say this was only because the conquerors had at least arrived from a neighboring civilizational world. Maybe Iran had survived one shock. Then the Turks arrived. And suddenly, the pattern faced a new test. The Seljuks were not Persian. They were a Turkic dynasty that rose out of the steppe world, built military power through conquest, and in the 11th century swept into Iran, Iraq, and beyond, becoming one of the dominant powers of the Islamic world. From a distance, this looks like the moment Iran should finally have been swallowed. First Arabs, now Turks, another ruling elite, another military aristocracy, another chance for Persian identity to become just a memory under someone else's banners. But that is not what happened. Because the Seljuks conquered the Iranian world militarily, yet almost as soon as they ruled it, they began ruling through Persian forms. They needed administrators. They needed men who knew how to tax, govern, and hold together a settled empire that was far more complicated than a battlefield confederation. And so once again, Iran moved inward, into the state itself. The most famous example was Nizam al-Mulk, the great Persian vizier of the Turkish Seljuk sultans, who served Alp Arslan and Malik Shah and became one of the defining architects of Seljuk government. Britannica describes him plainly as a Persian vizier of the Turkish Seljuk sultans, while Iranica treats him as one of the central figures of the dynasty's political world. That detail is not administrative trivia. It is the story. Because once a conquering dynasty needs Persian minds to make its empire work, conquest stops being a one-way act. The Seljuks had the sword. Iran still had the grammar of rule. Nizam al-Mulk's own great manual of kingship, the Siyasat-Nama, was written for a Seljuk ruler. But what runs through it is not some raw tribal ethos of conquest. It is an older, deeper political imagination. One shaped by the Persian bureaucratic world and by traditions of monarchy that long predated the Seljuks themselves. The Turks ruled, but increasingly through ideas. Iran. And it was not only government, it was language, it was literature, it was the atmosphere of power itself. Under the Seljuks, literary Persian spread even further across Iran. Britannica notes that literary Persian spread through the whole of Iran under their rule, while Arabic increasingly narrowed inside Iran to religious scholarship and related intellectual domains. That is an astonishing reversal when you remember where this story began. The empire that had once conquered Persia in the name of a new Arabic-speaking order had not erased Persian. And now a Turkish dynasty was presiding over the further expansion of Persian as the language of courtly expression and high. So what exactly was happening here? Not ethnic replacement, not civilizational purity. Something much more interesting. The Seljuks did not become Persians in any simple blood and soil sense. They remained a Turkic ruling house. Their military power came from Turkic traditions and steppe networks. But to rule Iran and to project legitimacy over a vast settled realm, they were drawn into a Persianate world of scribes, poets, court ceremony, urban administration, and kingship. Iran was teaching yet another conqueror how empire should look. The rulers could change. The civilizational operating system remained. Because now, the Arab conquest no longer looks like a unique exception. It looks like the first demonstration of something larger. Iran was not surviving by accident. It was surviving because its language, memory, and prestige were durable enough to outlive dynasties and attractive enough to colonize the imagination of those dynasties from within. Arab rulers had needed Persian administration. Turkish rulers now needed Persian statecraft and Persian cultural legitimacy. The civilization kept losing political masters and then quietly teaching those masters how to behave. That is not passive survival. That is civilizational gravity. But patterns only become convincing when they survive catastrophe. And the next catastrophe was beyond anything Iran had faced before. Not a dynasty from Arabia, not a military house from the steppe looking for a throne. Something far more apocalyptic. A force that did not seem interested in inheriting the old world at all, but in smashing it. The Mongols were coming. And this time, it looked like there would be nothing left to absorb them. If the Arab conquest was the first great shock, the Mongol invasion looked like the end of the world. Not the end of one dynasty, not the replacement of one ruling elite by another. The end of the world people knew how to imagine. When the Mongols entered the Iranian lands in the 13th century, they did not arrive as heirs to the old order. They arrived as a force of annihilation. And the scale of destruction they unleashed was so severe that Encyclopedia Iranica describes the invasion as a cataclysm that wrought vast devastation and demographic dislocation. Britannica goes even further in its biography of Hulagu, noting that some historians consider him to have done more than anyone else to destroy medieval Iranian culture. This is the point in the story where the old pattern should have failed. Because whatever survived the Arabs, whatever adapted under the Abbasids, whatever returned through Persian language and Turkish dynasties, now faced something more terrifying than conquest in the usual sense. Cities were broken. Populations were shattered. The Mongols did not come carrying a refined civilizational program for Iran. At first, they came as a storm. And when Hulagu founded the Ilkhanid state in 1256, and by 1258 had captured Baghdad and all of Iran, it felt as if the Perso-Islamic world itself had been ripped open. And yet, this is exactly where the deeper story becomes impossible to ignore. Because even this did not erase Iran. The Mongols ruled Iran as outsiders, yes. Iranica notes that the invasion brought Persia under non-Muslim rule for the first time since the Arab conquest. That alone tells you how profound the rupture was. But the same source also notes that rule by Muslim sovereigns was restored only 37 years after the sack of Baghdad, when Ghazan Khan converted to Islam in 1295 and required the Mongols in his realm to do likewise or depart. In other words, The force that had seemed to stand completely outside the Islamic and Iranian world was, within decades, being drawn into it. And that was not the only reversal. The Ilkhanids, though Mongol in origin, did not govern Iran in a vacuum. They needed ministers, scribes, historians, and fiscal experts. They needed men who could translate devastation into government. That is why Persian administrators and intellectuals once again moved into the heart of power. Ata Malik Juvayni, a Persian official and historian in Mongol service, wrote the first major historical work composed in Persian during the Mongol period. Iranica says his chronicle recorded the Mongol invasions from an Iranian and Islamic perspective, while trying to make sense of the calamity and the changes overtaking Persian government and society. That detail matters enormously. Even in catastrophe, Iran was narrating the disaster in its own voice. Then came Rashid al-Din. Serving the Ilkhanid rulers Ghazan and Oljetu, he oversaw the Jami al-Tawarikh, a vast historical work composed between 1300 and 1310. Iranica calls it a compilation of Islamic and Persian history, Mongol history, and the histories of many other peoples, so broad in scope that it has been described as the first world history. Think about the symbolism of that. The invaders who had seemed to shatter the old world ended up presiding over one of the great historical and intellectual projects of the medieval Iranian world, carried out by a Persian vizier at the center of Mongol power. And the political meaning of the Ilkhanids was just as striking. Britannica states that the Ilkhanids reunited Iran as a political and territorial entity after several centuries of fragmentation under smaller dynasties. Under Ghazan, it also describes an Iranian cultural renaissance in which figures like Rashid al-Din flourished. That is one of the strangest reversals in the entire story. A Mongol dynasty, born from one of the most destructive invasions in Iranian history, became one of the regimes through which Iran was politically recomposed and culturally revived. None of this makes the destruction less real. That is important. Iran did not glide through the Mongol catastrophe untouched. Whole regions were broken. Lives were obliterated. The trauma was genuine, and the recovery was uneven. But that is exactly why the recovery matters so much. If Iran had only survived softer conquests, the pattern would be less impressive. It survived this. It absorbed even this. Not immediately, not cleanly, but enough to reassert language, administration, Islam, political coherence, and historical memory inside a world that should have buried them all. By now, the story is larger than Arabs, larger than Turks, larger even than the Mongols. Because the same civilization keeps doing the same impossible thing. It keeps losing states and preserving itself. It keeps being ruled by outsiders and teaching those outsiders how to belong to the world they conquered. It keeps turning catastrophe into another chapter instead of a final ending. Which means the strongest weapon Iran ever had was not an army. It was memory. By this point, the pattern is too consistent to dismiss as luck. Empires fell. Dynasties vanished. Rulers arrived from Arabia, from the steppe, from the Mongol world. And still, something in Iran kept coming back. Not always quickly, not always triumphantly. Sometimes after ruin. Sometimes after humiliation. But it came back often enough to force a harder question. What was carrying this civilization through so many defeats? The answer was not military superiority. It was memory. Not memory in the sentimental sense, not vague pride. Something deeper and more disciplined than that. After the fall of the Sasanians, as Encyclopedia Iranica puts it, Persian urban literati began reconstructing the cultural idea of Iran inside the new Islamic world. That is one of the most important lines in the whole story. Iran did not survive only in bloodlines or borders. It survived because people kept rebuilding the idea of Iran, even after the state that once embodied it had died. This is where memory becomes a political force. A civilization survives when it can still describe itself to itself, when it still knows what its past means, when it can tell its children that this land is not just a territory, but part of a longer story. In medieval Iran, that story was carried through language, chronicles, court culture, and above all, through inherited visions of kingship, ancestry, and Iran Zamin, the land of Iran. The state could fracture. The memory of belonging to a civilizational world could endure. And no single work did more to harden that memory into cultural steel than the Shahnameh. Completed by Ferdowsi around 1010, the Shahnameh gave the Persian national epic its final and enduring form. Britannica describes it as a poem of nearly 60,000 verses, based mainly on earlier prose and Middle Persian traditions, carrying the story of Persian kings from mythical origins down to the fall of the Sasanians. That matters not because it preserved facts in some modern academic sense, but because it preserved continuity. It took a shattered past and turned it into a living inheritance. It told Persian-speaking audiences that before the conquest, before the caliphates, before the dynasties now ruling them, there was a deeper Iranian story, and it was still theirs. That is why the Shahnameh was more than literature. It was a recovery of civilizational confidence. A people who had lost an empire were hearing their past recited back to them in majestic Persian verse. Heroes, kings, betrayals, glories, collapses. All of it woven into one immense memory palace. The poem did not erase Islam, and it did not resurrect the Sasanian state. It did something subtler, and in the long run, more powerful. It made Iranian historical imagination durable again. It gave later generations a language for remembering themselves, even as they lived inside new political and religious worlds. And once that memory existed, conquerors kept getting drawn into it. Arab rulers had inherited Iranian administrative habits. Turkish rulers had adopted Persian court culture. Mongol rulers had ended up presiding over Iranian historians, Muslim conversions, and political recomposition. None of them needed to become ethnically Persian for the pattern to hold. They only needed to rule within a world where Persian memory, language, and prestige still defined what serious kingship looked like. That is the crucial point. Iran did not always control the throne, but it kept shaping the meaning of the throne. So when people ask why Iran never became Arab, they are really asking the wrong question. They imagine identity as something fixed on the surface, something that disappears the moment a conqueror arrives with a new religion, a new language of power, and a new elite. But Iran's story shows something harder to see. Civilizations are not only made of rulers, they are made of memory structures, of stories people refuse to lose, of languages that return, of prestige that outlives empires. Iran accepted transformation after transformation, yet it kept feeding those transformations back into a civilizational core that remained recognizably its own. And that means the final answer is now within reach. Iran did not survive by staying untouched. It survived by becoming one of history's great masters of transformation. Which means the last thing left to understand is the biggest thing of all. What kind of civilization can be conquered again and again and still make history remember it by its own name? So why did Iran never become Arab? Because that was never the same question as whether Iran was conquered. It was conquered. Deeply, violently, decisively. The Sasanian Empire fell. Islam entered and stayed. Arabic became the language of scripture, theology, and enormous intellectual prestige. Old elites were displaced. Old institutions were broken. The surface of Iranian life changed forever. But civilizations do not live only on the surface. That is the answer this whole story has been moving toward. Iran did not remain itself by avoiding change. It remained itself by surviving through change. It accepted a new religion without surrendering every older layer of identity. It absorbed Arabic influence without losing Persian language. It lost its empire without losing its historical imagination. And that is why the conquest of Persia did not end with Persia becoming Arab. The conquerors changed Iran, but they did not replace it. In fact, over time, the story became even stranger than survival. Because Iran did not just endure the new order, it began reshaping it. Persian administrators helped govern the caliphate. Persian language returned as a language of poetry, memory, and prestige. Persian court culture spread across the Eastern Islamic world. Turkic dynasties ruled through Persian forms. Mongol conquerors, after unimaginable destruction, were drawn into Iranian political and cultural worlds. Again and again, the rulers changed, but the civilizational gravity remained. That is what outsiders often miss. They look at history and assume identity is decided by the last successful army. They assume the map tells the whole truth. They assume that if a people adopt a new religion, a new script, a new dynasty, then they must have ceased to be themselves. But Iran's history points to something more complex and more profound. Civilizations can survive conquest when they preserve the deeper things: language, memory, prestige. The ability to define what power should look like, even when power is temporarily in someone else's hands. That is why this story is bigger than the 7th century. The Arab conquest was the first great test, but it was not the last. Greeks entered this world. Arabs entered it. Turks entered it. Mongols entered it. Each time, something was shattered. Each time, something changed. Each time, Iran was forced to adapt. And each time, after the ruin, the adjustment, the humiliation, and the reordering, Iran reappeared. Not as a fossil, not as a perfect continuation of the past, but as a civilization still able to name itself, still able to produce meaning, still able to turn invasion into another chapter instead of a final sentence. That is rare. Most civilizations do not get that many chances. Most are either erased or absorbed so completely that the older identity becomes an archaeological memory. Iran never became that. It remained one of history's few great examples of continuity without stasis, transformation without disappearance. A civilization that could be conquered politically, transformed religiously, even devastated militarily, and yet still preserve enough of its inner architecture to return again and again. And maybe that is the real reason this story still carries so much force now. Because modern Iran is not just a nation-state sitting on a map. It is also the inheritor of this long civilizational memory, this habit of survival through upheaval, this refusal to confuse transformation with surrender. The tension that still runs through Iranian identity today, between old and new, between religion and nation, between rupture and continuity, makes more sense when you see how deep the pattern goes. Iran did not emerge from history by staying untouched. It emerged by learning, across centuries, how to remain itself while being changed by forces it could not fully escape. That is a harder kind of endurance than simple resistance. It is easier to admire the civilization that never bends. It is more difficult, and perhaps more impressive, to understand the civilization that bends, breaks, absorbs, rebuilds, and still remains recognizable to itself. That was Iran's achievement. Not purity, not isolation, not invincibility. Something more durable than all of those things. Iran did not survive history by escaping conquest. It survived by turning conquest into continuity.